Welcome to the next episode of Fridays with Fintelekt. My guest today is Daniel Thelesklaf, a lawyer by profession who joined the Swiss Federal Police Office for Police in 1998 and went on to become the first director of the Swiss FIU after a career in private sector banking and insurance. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today. And at the outset, can you run our listeners quickly through your professional journey in the world of AML CFT, the current roles and committees that you're involved in, and anything else that would give our viewers a better understanding of you?
Hi, Pathak. First, thanks for having me here. It's a great series you're having. I'm very honored and privileged to be part of it, and it's a great initiative in these strange times we're living in. Yes, to run through my professional journey. Well, it was a long journey, and at the time in the late '80s when I studied law in Switzerland, this was not a discipline. Nobody early talks about compliance and anti-money laundering, but it wasn't regarded as something predominantly very important. I then joined, I went to the private sector directly. I ended up in a private bank in Switzerland. And of course, in the late '80s, this became then more and more an important topic, but it's still regarded something that can be somewhat annexed to the legal service and probably let the lawyers deal with it. And finally, I learned how banks work, which helped me later on, but also saw the little we have been doing in the late '80s on that topic. I mean, not only in Switzerland, but everywhere. Especially when you compare it to where banks are now, the financial sector, I think, at large are now, this has been a huge journey for that sector. But I was involved in a working group at the time on the implementation of the first Swiss anti-money laundering law. So I got in touch with the authorities, and when they were looking for the first director of the FIU, I somewhat got teased, and a headhunter was calling me and asked me if I don't want to apply. And in a way, initially I excluded that option because I didn't want to become a bureaucrat. We all have our preconception about how public service works, and elements of it are true. But then I was very much inspired by the director of the department at the time that was responsible for the FIU, who later became the Swiss Attorney General. And I felt like, okay, working with people like him is actually a privilege. And I had the pleasure then to move to jump over the fence to some degree, because the authorities were actually looking for somebody from the private sector. It was challenging to establish an FIU in that culture of confidentiality, banking secrecy environment. It was against everything a Swiss banker has been living. To make a report about your client to the authorities was really couldn't be more strange than that. But that was an interesting experience. It was increasingly, we had to deal with bureaucracy and lack of resources. So after 3 years, when I had the opportunity to work more internationally and to help other countries to build up FIUs and to strengthen their anti-money laundering regimes, I couldn't resist the temptation. So, and what came now is a bit, probably what characterizes my professional journey most is that I've learned how to tackle the issue of financial crime from very different perspectives. So for a few years, I was working as a consultant, technical assistance projects from the Caribbean to Central Asia to Eastern Europe, Africa. So, and I think this was a very enriching journey because there's no one size that fits all. There's no one recipe that works everywhere. You always have to implement these requirements in the given context of a country or of a culture or of a legal environment. So that was extremely enriching. I then went back to Switzerland. I had the chance to go to a think tank as another perspective on things. I was affiliated to the University of Basel, with very hands-on assistance to countries in asset recovery. So it was funded by development agencies who thought it is more than unfair to be attractive for foreign investment, which is nothing bad, but then not to do anything about the risk of being attractive to foreign investments stemming from proceeds of crime. So that was the main job, to actually assist countries in recovering assets which were the proceeds of crime. It was a long journey. It was a very enriching experience too. And then what I missed a bit was the very operational work. So this is why when the call came from our neighboring country, Liechtenstein, who has a lot of common with Switzerland, to become the director of the FIU there, I couldn't resist. And I was really enjoying that time a lot. In particular, the opportunity that arose from them becoming first the deputy chairman of Moneyval, and then in 2015 the chairman of Moneyval, so the regional European FSRB, working very closely with the FATF. And this was the period when we started to conduct a new round of evaluations and all the challenges that came with it. So finally, I went back to Switzerland, was appointed again the head of the FIU. That was a bit an unfortunate part of the journey. It was a great team. I had the really privilege to work with absolutely professional people, but I think my view on how the FIU should act collided a bit with the view of the management, and then it simply doesn't make sense to continue. So since a few days, I'm a consultant again. I will do a lot of work for another FIU in Europe and accompany that country in the journey through the assessment process, but also continue to engage again in technical assistance for major international organizations. So you see, I think that's the common denominator is really tackle financial crimes from all different sides, and I think at the end that's exactly what it needs.
Right. I think it has, it sounds to have been a very fascinating and unique journey. I don't think there would be many other people in the world who have really, gone through what you've gone through. So, extremely fascinating. So let me take you back to your days of, when you were heading an FIU, what would you say were the top 3 expectations that you had from banks and other reporting entities? And, have you seen AML CFT compliance really evolve regionally in line with your expectations?
It certainly has evolved. Probably expectations are always a bit higher than what you can do in reality. But things have, in the 25 years I'm in the business, have evolved drastically. And I think it proportionally, achievements in the private sector have actually evolved more than in the public sector. I think we should honestly say that public sector was more engaged in the beginning, 25 years ago. They were the drivers, and this has somewhat changed. And maybe 3 expectations. That's a good question. I think the first one sounds a bit theoretical, but I think it's very relevant when you have to decide whether you do a business or not. And the advice would be, or the expectation would be, not to refrain from any business for your client that you wouldn't do yourself. Because it doesn't make sense, because it's far too complicated, because it's too risky. So apply the same standard that you do for your own business. Also apply it for whether you help your client do the same activity. The second, it's a common theme, and it's probably something you heard before a lot of time. But if you think compliance is too expensive, try non-compliance. I mean, it's simple, but when it comes to investing in compliance, you have to convince your chief financial officer to do the right thing, and you have to, if you engage in the private sector, and if you have expectations from a public sector view on the financial industry, you have to provide the numbers. You have to provide a business case, and you have to show if what you do is causing harm, and why it is not acceptable. I think the problem we're having in fighting money laundering in particular, that it is sometimes very abstract. Nobody has been threatened by a money launderer personally. Probably very few of us have ever seen one or knew that they would see one. It's not a form of crime that really affects, our kids' lives. We don't have to be afraid of that in a tangible way. But if you look behind it, what it means for the victims of a crime that have been defrauded, that have been put in slavery, that have become victims of human trafficking, getting the money back means a lot of them. That's a form of, I think it's more than illegal. It's also a moral obligation that we have. And I think that's something we have. That's an expectation, is always to understand what you do has an impact on victims of crime, and everybody can become a victim. I think the third one is in that eternal debate, if you like, conversation we have between the public and the private sector. An expectation of both is try to understand where the other one stands, how he's working, what the challenges are that he or she are facing. So try to understand better the position of the other one, and then you'll better understand the expectation of each other's and the possibilities. I think that's maybe not the top three, but that's three expectations that come to my mind.
Excellent. Thanks, Daniel, for that. So, Daniel, you know that there is a significant difference in regulatory compliance maturity amongst countries. And this sometimes creates a regulatory arbitrage that is being exploited by money launderers. Now, as someone who has been involved closely with Moneyval and the FATF, do you see any specific areas of international cooperation that might actually result in more consistency in AML frameworks applied across the globe?
Well, first of all, I think you're right. There is a risk of regulatory arbitrage, and probably that risk has increased. I think 25 years ago, it was probably not so relevant, because at the end of the day, a professional money launderer would need the services of financial institutions in a developed country. I wouldn't say you can't do it without a Swiss bank or a UK bank or a US bank, but at the end of the day, you need banking and you need professional services as a professional money launderer. So the deficiencies in a country that doesn't offer that level of service may not be as relevant as deficiencies in a developed country. This has, however, changed. Banking has changed, and technology allows now to provide excellent financial services all over the world. So and this is why lack of compliance in a given country can be a larger risk than it used to be. And certainly, you're right to say that international cooperation is key to address these issues. Now, again, following up on what I said before, trying to understand your partner in that fight against crime means, for example, in international cooperation among FIUs, there's an idea of more staff exchange. So FIUs from one country would spend certain time in the FIU of another country. It's something that works perfectly well in the private sector already. There's a fantastic initiative at the Egmont Group through the ECOFEL, the Egmont Center of Excellence and Leadership, where this is part of the program, is to support countries for staff exchanges. So I think that's a wonderful method that should be utilized more often. We can learn so much from each other. And again, it's not north, south, east, west. We can all learn from each other a lot. Certainly, I have learned probably more in countries that some would consider lower capacity countries. I think they have tremendous capacities, and we could learn a lot from them. Also, I've seen a few examples of bilateral partnerships that can be strengthened. International cooperation is something that is done between people. Of course, you need the instruments and technology and all that, but that's the easier part. It's trusting each other. You do not share information, confidential information, sensitive information with somebody you don't trust. And building up bilateral partnerships between countries which have a lot of shady business with each other, to put it bluntly, can help address building up that trust, which then is the basis for enhanced international cooperation.
Right. So, Daniel, arguably the gaps in the AML regime are really not due to the absence of the right standards, but due to the lack of effective implementation of these standards, right? So what is your opinion on the way both public and private sector entities are implementing the FATF recommendations? I know you just brought out, some of the differences between public and private and what you've seen over the years, but where would you say is the scope for improvement? And also, do you think the FATF process of mutual evaluations is really democratic and that all countries, again, you touched upon this slightly in the previous one, should be painted with the same brush regardless of parameters like access to resources or skilled expertise that is available within the country?
Well, let me start by acknowledging what we have already achieved. which is not enough. Money laundering is going on, but we do have a common international standard to combat money laundering and terrorist financing. Now, this sounds easy and like given, but it's not. I wish we would have similar standards in other forms of crime too. So that's already a great achievement. But you were right. I mean, if you compare the laws of a smaller African country to large Western countries, they look very similar. Sometimes even copy pasted, you know. So it's really not about the law, but the implementation. When it comes to implementation, and this is demonstrated by the results of the mutual assessments, which are all public and show the deficiencies of countries and the strengths, you do see differences, but you also see commonalities. So if you, for example, look at the effectiveness of the preventative measures, they're pretty bad across the board. Now, no country has ever received a good rating in that. Apologies. So I think there's scope for improvement, of course, but also we should probably be more precise on what the expectations are. I mean, it was a fantastic idea to measure effectiveness. It's very challenging, and you come up with issues of equal treatment and so on. People will start comparing. But certainly on what we have learned in the last, what was that now, 6 years about since we're doing that, we've learned a lot. So it's time to see where we are, make a thorough assessment analysis of what has worked and what hasn't worked, and better fine-tune the way how we measure effectiveness, in particular in the area of prevention. But also to the second part of your question, I do think we have to better take into consideration the contextual factors of each country. You know, if a country has significant deficiencies, but is not a threat to any other country because it basically offers nearly zero cross-border financial services, then I think they should be taken into consideration. And you cannot require the same from a country that is pretty isolated, is hardly connected to other countries through you know, financial streams. You cannot expect the same then from a large financial center that is connected to any other country, and for that reason is more a threat to another country. So I think it's good that we base our assessment on risk, but probably should increase also the understanding of threat of a given country and the way it works. When we did our first assessment in Moneywell, the first country we assessed was Armenia, and they ended up with pretty good ratings. They're still one of the record holders, I think, if you compare it. And people were looking and saying, well, how can you know, this is a small country, it's not a very developed one, sort of middle income country. How can you give them these ratings? And we said, this is fully justified by the fact that Armenia is a landlocked country, you know, not really connected to others. It's not a financial center. So that makes sense for us because we weighted these contextual factors. And this should be, I think, there should be more clearly, and that would also increase the acceptance of countries. Some countries feel badly treated. Some were badly treated for good reasons, but I think we have to better explain what the threat is from the given country and then make the assessment based also on this threat.
Right, very, very well articulated, Daniel. So Daniel, fighting modern slavery is something that you are very involved in. Can you tell us a bit about the Liechtenstein initiative, about the work it is doing to enable reformed criminals to re-enter the financial system and start working again? And also more recently, you have joined as ambassador at the Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking, the FAST. So can you share more information with us about the FAST initiative and the work that you'll be doing with them?
Thanks for asking me about it. This is an initiative that comes from the bottom of my heart, and I feel very strongly associated with it. When we started to work on what can finance do to prevent and tackle modern slavery and human trafficking, I had no idea what this is all about. And the first figure I saw is that these crimes generate roughly $150 billion per year. And when I looked at our stats, you know, what do we detect in suspicious transaction reports in terms of convictions or confiscations? This didn't appear. So it was quite evident that all our instruments we have do not work in that regard. And there's a lot of profit is being made, and a lot of people get very rich through committing that crime, and we can't tackle that. So this was the starting point for me to say there's something wrong here and we need to fix it. And the second element that made me really change my mind and made me so enthusiastic about the work we have been doing and continue to do is the fact that we put together a commission of wise people. I don't know if I was wise, but I think of experienced people. And we also included survivors. And that has completely changed the conversation. We do a lot of work, all of us do a lot of work in anti-money laundering and combating financing of terrorism, but we hardly ever talk to victims. And we hardly ever include them as if they weren't present. And we had two survivors in the commission, and they were completely driving the agenda. You know, they explained what they have gone through. They also explained what they have been doing with financial institutions after they were liberated from this horrible situation in which they were enslaved. And this was so encouraging because you could see concrete results stemming from that work. So, and that we also included the banks in that work. It was a partnership, if you like. And then it was sometimes the bankers who would ask the question, what can we do more? And that's not a conversation we usually have when we talk about regulation. So this was really, I think, great work we did. We came up with a blueprint, a report for recommendations addressed to the private sector, to finance, which, and this is now also my role, is now in the process of implementation. This is not only on anti-money laundering and combating financing of terrorism. This is one of the 5 pillars where we came up with recommendations. A large part is also with finance as investors and the leverage you can have as an investor, whether you invest in a business where you give grant a loan to a business or not, and whether you take into consideration the risk of modern slavery and human trafficking way down the supply chain of your client. There's a lot that's going on. So my role as ambassador is to engage with financial institutions, get them on board, make them implement recommendations we have done. We only came up with very practical things, doable things, tangible results to be expected. So that will guide me through the next 10 to 12 months. And certainly, this is particularly glad that I can speak to you today in Asia. This is not that slavery wouldn't exist in our countries. It's not visible, but it does exist. But I think in Asia, given the role of the financial industry, the potential for leverage is probably very, very big there. So we hope we can engage more also with financial institutions.
Absolutely, absolutely, Daniel. So, Daniel, in the past, there has been a lot of talk around public-private partnerships, and I think recently that's highlighted quite a bit. There are also different types of partnership models that have come up. So, can you take us through some of the challenges that come up while setting up a public-private partnership? What can be expected realistically from such partnerships? And are there any either good or best practices that you have seen in your experience, for a successful model?
Well, thank you for that question too. And I must say, when I first heard about it 4 or 5 years ago, I was a bit skeptical. I say, a partnership with financial institutions. I mean, they're usually the targets of our investigation. So that's not a partner, that's a target. But I have come from somebody very skeptical to somebody who is sees a huge potential in that. First of all, because what I said in the beginning, major financial institutions have changed their behavior. Still struggling, but we all struggle. So fair enough, but they have increased their efforts tremendously. Of course, this was driven by sanctions and bad news and so on. So, but whatever the reason is, if you change behavior to the positive, I don't care why you do that, as long as it's sustainable. And I think this behavioral change in especially major international financial institutions is sustainable. I don't think that can ever go back. a bit worried about news of staff cuts in compliance, also in large financial institutions. I would think twice about that. That's not a very wise investment. But in general, this has started to convince me. And then seeing how these partnerships work in practice. And I don't want to single out any of them. There's more and more popping up, which is good, but probably similar in the UK, but also the ones in Singapore and Hong Kong and Australia have shown that they actually bring concrete results. And this is a challenge that can be addressed, is that you need to have a very clear idea what results you're expecting, and you need to set up a model for measuring that success too. At the very beginning of setting up a partnership, managing expectations. The banks will come with their expectations. Be clear if you are from the public side also to bring in your expectations and see how they can be brought together and leveled. Resources. I see a number of countries coming up, they just label something public-private partnership, which existed before as a kind of regular meetings with the private sector. That's not a public-private partnership. And you can see the difference if you look whether additional resources have been made available for that. And it takes a lot from both sides. Also, I think an important element for these partnerships is to work at eye level. So a partnership is a partnership if both partners bring the same to the table. You can see that in co-chairmanships, you can see them in rotating chairmanships, you can see that in working groups being led by the private sector or by the public sector. Doesn't really matter how you do it, but that equal footing should be an important element of your work. And then certainly also a challenge is that you may want a bit over-ambitious in the beginning, and then disappointing if things don't roll exactly the way you want it to roll. So think of a phased approach. Start with the things that you can do already within the given legal framework, and then start to push the boundaries and build up that trust. Because where I came from, level of skepticism, although I've worked in the private sector, or maybe because I worked in the private sector, is there. And it's also there in the private sector. So you have to build up that level of trust on both sides, and then I think you will succeed. But for me, it's key. It's probably the most promising element of an anti-money laundering strategy that I can currently think of.
Great, Daniel. So, Daniel, in closing, what is the advice that you would give to compliance officers in reporting entities to deal with this volatile, regulatory, political, and social environment that we're experiencing currently? Any, final thoughts to them?
Well, as much as I know that this is maybe not exactly what I want to say, but probably you need to end up in specialization. I mean, the days of the generalist compliance AML officer are gone. I probably belong to the generation where you thought you can cover everything. So the landscape has become very diverse. There's a lot of technology. I think that's certainly an area where it's promising to engage in the use of technology in anti-money laundering, how we can use technology to become more effective and reduce costs, because the costs have become so tremendous, we have to rethink that model. I think, especially for financial institutions that work internationally, it's really that being curious about how others do it and be ready to learn from others. Because I think at the end of the day, that's the big advantage of the criminals, is they have these intercultural networks that work brilliantly in all countries affected, and we are not yet at that same level. But certainly be proud what you do. This is a service to public safety. This is a service to potential victims. You can help them. Don't forget that it's very relevant what you're doing. And don't be frustrated if you don't see immediate results. There is something happening that you may not see so clearly as we all wanted to see, but there's something happening which is very important. So have that, ethical compass also in front of you, and keep having that. I know it's challenging, but you will be rewarded at the end.
Right. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us today. It was an absolute pleasure listening to you, and I think it's going to be absolutely enlightening to our community. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks a lot, Pathak, for the excellent conversation we're having and for your questions. Thanks.